Hi everyone, and welcome to HD Cast. Have you ever come up with an idea that felt completely original, only to later realize it's a mashup of things that you've seen or heard before? Perhaps you sketched a brilliant new gadget, then noticed it was basically a smartphone with a projector bolted on. Or you dreamed up a fantasy novel plot, then saw a similar story in an old myth. Moments like these make you wonder, is anything truly new? Or is creativity just combining what we already know? Well, in this episode, we're going to explore that very question in depth. I'll take you along on a journey that began with a personal hunch and led through neuroscience labs, AI research, and even the pages of history books. The idea at the heart of it is something called input recombination model of human creativity, which is the notion that our most inventive thoughts aren't conjured from thin air, but rather constructed by recombining inputs we've gathered over time. In other words, perhaps every new idea is really a novel collage of pre-existing pieces. Now, this concept may sound a bit counterintuitive or even disappointing at first. But as we'll see, it's actually a fascinating lens that demystifies creativity without diminishing it. Along the way, I discovered some eye-opening insights like the creativity paradox. While limits can boost creativity, the idea of an information density threshold, why having more knowledge can suddenly spark leaps of insight, and something called the inverse cognitive hierarchy, how big ideas can bubble up from little connections in the brain, and the possibility of recombination saturation, whether there's a point where all the obvious combinations are used up. Well, we'll unpack all of these things as we go ahead. Now, by the end of it, we'll also talk about what this model means for our understanding of the mind, for artificial intelligence, for creative work itself, and even for the deep philosophical questions like consciousness and free will. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. To kick things off, I want to share how this whole investigation began with a simple personal reflection that refused to let go of my curiosity. It all started with a bit of soul searching about my own creative process. As a writer and an avid consumer of books and movies, I began noticing a pattern. Whenever I had a new idea, I could often trace its lineage back to its earlier inputs. For example, I once drafted a short story about a detective in a virtual reality world, and I was so proud of its originality. Later, I realized I had basically combined the elements of Matrix with Sherlock Holmes style mystery. The pieces were entirely familiar, even though the combination was uniquely mine. I had a deja vu of the I've seen this before, just not in this form sorts. This got me thinking about other creators. I remembered reading that even the great Walt Disney didn't pull Mickey Mouse out of the void. He drew inspiration from his pet mouse, plus the popular anthropomorphic animal cartoons of his era. Songwriters often admit their music is influenced by earlier genres and artists. Inventors take devices that already exist and put them together in new ways. There's a famous quote often attributed, perhaps wrongly, to Picasso: "Good artists copy, great artists steal." What it implies is that originality might just be creative theft, or more gently, creative recombination. Well, at some point, a light bulb went off in my head, and I formed a hypothesis of sorts where human creativity works by taking in inputs we collect from our environment, our memories, our knowledge, our experiences, and remixing or recombining them into newer outputs. The truly novel spark is in the combination, not in the raw material appearing from nowhere. Maybe nothing is 100% so generous. Instead, each idea is born from older ideas meeting each other for the first time in our minds. It was an intriguing hypothesis, but I knew anecdotes and gut feelings weren't enough. I wanted to test whether this holds up under serious scrutiny, so I began an intellectual scavenger hunt through different domains of knowledge. How does the brain come up with these ideas? Could neuroscience reveal recombination mechanism at work? What about artificial intelligence, especially modern AI that can produce creative outputs? Is it just recombining learned patterns? And what can history and culture tell us about creativity? Have people always built on old ideas? Well, I dived into research and the journey was full of surprises and aha moments. Let's follow the trail, starting with the biology of the creative brain. My first stop was neuroscience. After all, creativity ultimately happens between our ears. If the input recombination model is right, our brains should show signs of recycling and remixing old information when we create. I soon found that cognitive scientists have been homing in on several ideas here. Creative thinking is tightly linked to memory. In fact, one prominent researcher, Harvard psychologist Daniel Sacher, defines divergent creative thinking as the ability to generate new ideas by recombining information in novel ways. And the emphasis on recombining information there was in black and white. Sacher's experiments are fascinating. He explored how remembering past experiences can fuel imaginative thinking about the future, and by extension, fuel creativity. In one study, people were asked to come up with novel uses for everyday objects, like a classical test of creativity known as the alternative use task. But first, some of them were primed with a memory exercise. They watched a short video and then described it in detail, basically reactivating their episodic memory. And the result? Those who had their memories primed produced more creative ideas for the object's uses than those who didn't. And in parallel brain scans, the hippocampus, a brain's region of the central to the memory, lit up more in memory-primed folks as they brainstormed creatively. In other words, digging into memory boosted their divergent thinking, and we could see the brain's memory center actively at work during idea generation. Now, this suggests a picture of how the brain brews new ideas. It reaches back into storehouse of memories, both episodic memories of events and semantic memories of facts and concepts, pulls out various bits, and then recombines them in novel concoctions. When you imagine a fantastic scenario, say a flying car, your brain might be retrieving car and perhaps that hovercraft toy you saw and blending the elements of them. You're not consciously doing all those retrievals one by one, but under the hood, the network that encode past experiences are being tapped and tweaked. In fact, the brain's default mode network, which is active during daydreaming, mind-wandering, and imagination, heavily involves memory regions. It's like mind's remix DJ spinning old records into a new mixtape. Now, one empirical thought I love here is that creative brains are a bit sloppy with their memories. And that's actually quite beneficial. Sacher and colleagues found that the individual who excel at divergent thinking tend to have more memory distortions. They're more likely to falsely remember things that didn't happen or mix up details. Now that sounds bad, but think about it. If creativity requires flexible recombining information, a rigid memory that never blurs or blends might be a hindrance. The creative brain's willingness to err, to see connections where strict truths say there are none, could be the very mechanism that allows for new ideas to form. It's as if allowing a few memory mistakes is the price of admission for inventiveness. A comforting thought for the next time you misremember something, and maybe it's your creative sparkle showing. Another line of research zeroes in on the idea of connecting distant concepts. Cognitive psychologists use the terms like semantic distance, which is basically how far apart two ideas are in meaning, to quantify creative thought. If I ask you to name the first word that comes to mind when I say coffee, you might say cup, which is quite closely related, short semantic distance, or you might say nebula, which is very, very far, as there's no obvious link between them. Well, it turns out the ability to bridge big semantic distances is hallmark of creativity. A recent large-scale study introduced something called the divergent association task, where people were asked to list words as unrelated to each other as possible, and then researchers measured the average semantic distance among those words. And the result? Well, the greater the semantic distance is, the higher the person's creativity scores on standard tests. In fact, The simple task of naming unrelated words was as predictive of creativity as many traditional creative assessments. Now, what does this mean essentially? Well, it means creative thinkers can link the unlinkable. They can take concepts that are seemingly worlds apart and find or forge a connection between them. That's recombination in action. The farther the ingredients are from each other, the more novel the mix. Now, you might be wondering, so is my brain just constantly remixing stuff without me knowing? In a sense, yes. We often experience ideas coming to us suddenly, which are the aha moments. But research suggests that before the conscious revelation, our brain has been subconsciously marinating the idea by shuffling through memories and knowledge. One neuroscientist memorably called it the prepared mind. Here, creativity favors those minds that have richly filled stores of diverse information and mental flexibility to shuffle them around. This raises an interesting notion of an informed density threshold, which is perhaps you need a critical mass of inputs before a truly novel recombination can pop out. A child who's only ever seen a few examples of animals and vehicles might not conceive the concept of a flying car. But feed them enough tales of birds and engines, and one day, eureka! The brain might operate like a network that reaches a tipping point where enough nodes are present that new links suddenly form. This threshold idea will come up again later when we talk about AI and historical innovation. It seems to hold there too. Now, before we leave the brain science, it's worth noting a paradoxical truth that emerged: the creativity paradox of constraints. Well, we've been talking about having more information and broad-ranging memory as fuel for creativity, which sounds like removing the limits, right? But it turns out some self-imposed limits can also ignite creative recombination. Neuroscience and psychology studies show that when you force the brain to work with a tighter set of ingredients, it often yields surprisingly innovative results. For example, a psychologist named Catherine Trom tested what she dubbed the green eggs and ham hypothesis of creativity, named after the Dr. Seuss book written with only 50 different words. In her experiment, students had to write greeting card rhymes. And on some trials, they were given a random word that must be included, which is like a hard constraint. The outcome here? Well, according to independent judges, the rhymes created under the constraints were more creative than those written with no special limits. So even more interesting, after working under restriction first, students tended to be more creative later in unrestricted tasks than students who started unrestricted. This is the creativity paradox. By narrowing options or adding constraints, we actually push our brains to recombine the limited inputs in more original ways, perhaps because we can't go with the obvious solution and have to get more resourceful. It's like telling a chef that they can only use 5 ingredients. They might invent a dish far more novel and clever if they had a full pantry at their disposal. So while having a rich pantry of knowledge is good, sometimes deliberately closing it and forcing recombination of just a few pieces yields magic. The brain, it seems, thrives on balance between freedom and constraint. Too much freedom can be overwhelming, which is sort of a blank page syndrome, and some constraints can focus the creative search. So, to sum up a neuroscience excursion, our brains create by remembering and mixing. The hippocampus drags out old memories, the default network stirs them together, and the executive control network likely helps to evaluate and define these ideas. Creative thought lights up a dynamic interplay of brain networks, which is a conversion between spontaneous and the controlled, between memory and imagination. It's a bit poetic. We imagine the future using pieces of the past. With this understanding of the remix mechanism in our head, I turned to a very different avenue for insight. I wanted to see if machines, like computers, might shed light on human creativity by that analogy. After all, if an AI can write a story or paint an image, how is it doing so? Is it truly inventing or just shuffling learned patterns? Let's talk about AI next. Now, if human brains create by recombination, One would expect that a sufficiently advanced computer could do similar things given enough inputs. And indeed, in recent years, we've seen AI systems produce outputs that look creative, from generating music and art to writing essay and code. The poster child is the family of large language models like OpenAI's GPT, which can generate stories and poems and ideas seemingly out of thin air. Having followed the development of these AIs, I recall feeling both awe and a hint of existential dread at their capabilities. But the question pertinent to our discussion is, how are they doing this? Are they fundamentally mimicking the input recombination process, or did we accidentally stumble upon some synthetic genius that truly invents? Well, I dug into AI research and commentary, and a clear consensus emerged. Current AI creativity is largely a remix job. As one AI expert bluntly put it, an LLM doesn't create in a vacuum. Any idea it generates is at best a recombination or extrapolation of patterns from its training data. LLMs are often described as stochastic parrots, which is a cheeky way of saying that they statistically predict text based on examples they've seen without genuine understanding. They shuffle and stitch together fragments of those examples in fluent ways. Now, this might sound unflattering, but in practice, the results can be impressively original seeming. One researcher linked it to how a human might creatively synthesize knowledge. The AI remembers a ton of information and then recombines that information according to probabilistic rules it learned. The renowned cognitive scientist Margaret Borden provides a useful framework here. She distinguishes between the different types of creativity, which is combinatorial creativity, which is putting familiar ideas together in a new combination, exploratory creativity, which is exploring a conceptual space to find something new but still within the established rules and styles, and transformational creativity, which is changing the rules of the game to allow entirely unprecedented ideas. Now, interestingly, analysis of LLM suggests they are most limited to the first two types, combinatorial and to an extent exploratory, but not truly transformational. In plain terms, a model like GPT-4 can remix concepts it knows and apply known methods in novel contexts, which yields outputs that can actually surprise us. However, it won't fundamentally break its training mold or invent a totally alien style of writing on its own. For example, it might produce a creative recipe by combining Indian and Italian cuisine elements, something novel yet grounded in existing culinary knowledge. But it won't spontaneously invent a whole new genre of cuisine without being led there because it's constrained by what it has learned. As one analysis put it, the transformational creativity is not achievable through the current LLM training solutions. The model doesn't redefine the boundaries of art or science, it sort of mimics and interpolates within them. Some empirical findings drive home how heavily LLM-generated ideas lean on recombination. A 2023 experiment had an AI generate hundreds of research paper ideas for various scientific topics. Researchers then used a semantic similarity filter to weed out redundant or too similar ideas. The result was striking. Around 95% of AI's raw ideas were essentially duplicates or minor variations of each other, leaving only about 5% that were truly unique after filtering. In other words, the machine tended to produce a lot of repetitive combinations, and only a small fraction stood out as distinct. This highlights a limited diversity in its creative output. When left unguided, it's recombining pieces in somewhat habitual patterns unless forced to diverge. Human creators, of course, can also fall into the ruts of cliché, but we have additional faculties like intentional search or emotional guidance to push for more variety. Now, another fascinating concept I came across in AI literature was the idea of B novelty versus H novelty, or novelty to the beholder versus historical novelty. An AI might produce something that you find novel and brilliant because you hadn't seen the particular combination before. However, if that combination already existed somewhere in its vast training data or could have been predicted from it, then in historical or absolute sense, it's actually not new. It's just new to you. Researchers noted that LLMs often achieve this novelty in the eyes of the beholder. For instance, you might be amazed by a sci-fi story about space travel and medieval knights that an AI writes, thinking it's so creative, so cool. But perhaps unbeknownst to you, some niche author in 1975 wrote a similar tale. The AI isn't endowed with a mystical well of imagination. It's pulling from the wells of human literature, which collectively have explored many wild ideas. When it pairs concept A from over here with concept B from over there, the result appears inventive, especially if you, the reader, never encountered A plus B combination before. Yet, to a hypothetical omniscient observer, the AI hasn't truly gone beyond what humanity already had in the archive. By contrast, a truly groundbreaking or a transformational idea would be novel in a broad sense, something that wasn't just lurking unobserved in the data, but genuinely original to the world. To date, we don't have evidence of AI doing that on its own. So, current AI creativity aligns well with the input recombination model. Give the machine enormous inputs, which is also training data, and it can spit out new outputs that are recombinations of those inputs. No magic spark, no consciousness required, just statistical pattern matching at a mind-boggling scale. This serves as a kind of proof of concept for recombinatorial creativity. In a way, it's a mini model of how a human might digest a lifetime of experiences and then produce art or ideas. However, the differences between AI and human creativity are also telling. Notably, humans have intent, motivation, and self-directed goals. I create because I want to express something or solve something. AI has no internal drive. It won't wake up and decide to seek a novel idea for its own sake. It only generates when prompted by us. Also, humans can judge and filter their ideas based on real-world understanding and values, whereas an AI might lack that grounding, which is sometimes producing ideas that are logically or ethically off, but it doesn't truly understand the implications, it's just recombining the words. So, interestingly, one could argue that the lack of true understanding in AI underscores how powerful pure recombination can be. These models can appear creative and even insightful without any conscious awareness, suggesting that a lot of creativity might be attributable to the mechanics of recombination alone. It raises a provocative thought. If a souped-up autocomplete can produce an innovative essay, perhaps our own innovation is also more algorithmic than we'd like to admit. That said, there might be levels of creativity AIs haven't reached today. Like, what if transformational creativity requires an adaptive or a conscious agent to recognize the value of going beyond these rules? This remains an open question, honestly, and a frontier for both cognitive science and AI research. Now, before we move on, let me tie this back to an earlier notion: the informational density threshold. In AI, we've seen that scaling up the amount of input data and model size led to qualitative improvements in capability. A small model with a few million parameters trained on limited text was not very creative or coherent, but a giant model with hundreds of billions of parameters trained on virtually the whole internet begins to exhibit surprising competencies, even rudiments of common sense and coding ability. At some point, the system crossed a threshold where the richness of its absorbed information enabled much more flexible combinations, essentially enough knowledge to combine that it could tackle tasks never explicitly seen. Humans might have analogous thresholds. A person who only ever studies one field might struggle to produce groundbreaking ideas, but someone at the intersection of multiple domains or with a wealth of diverse experiences might suddenly have the capacity to make big creative leaps. It's like piling up logs, and at a certain critical mass, sparks can ignite into a flame that wouldn't catch on sparse fuel. History actually bears this out, which conveniently is our next destination, looking at innovation and creativity through the historical and cultural lens. Continuing, the saying "there's nothing new under the sun" dates back at least with the biblical book of Ecclesiastes thousands of years ago. It reflects the age-old observation that human creations are iterative. Each generation builds on and reworks the creations of the past. As I ventured into historical and cultural studies of creativity, this theme popped up everywhere. It's reassuring in a way. If our great-grandparents already suspected that all ideas are remix, then my little hypothesis is hardly radical. But let's get specific here. How have recombination and input dependence shown up in the evolution of ideas? One vivid metaphor I came across compared creativity to plant breeding. The writer described visiting a tulip garden filled with hybrid flowers that never existed in nature until very recently. They were bred by cross-pollinating distinct varieties. A blue-black tulip and a yellow tulip combined to make a new swirled one. The writer saw this as a perfect metaphor for artistic creativity. Just as horticulturalists make new flowers from old species, creators make new work from old motifs. And sometimes the hybrids are the most stunning of all. Consider the world of storytelling. Even Stephen King, a master of horror and imagination, once pulled back the curtains on where his ideas came from. He said, "Good story ideas seem to come quite literally from nowhere, sailing at you right out of the empty sky." But then he clarified, two previously unrelated ideas come together and make something new under the sun. Your job isn't to find these ideas, but to recognize them when they show up. Notice that even King, in describing almost mystical arrival of an idea, ends up pointing to recombination. It's previously unrelated ideas coming together. The seeming out of nowhere epiphany is really the moment two sparks connect. Hollywood offers plenty of explanations of deliberate recombination. One famous case, Star Wars. George Lucas didn't invent it ex nihilo. He combined the high-tech trappings of science fiction with ancient heroes' journey of mythos, inspired by Joseph Campbell's writings on mythology. Spaceships and sword-wielding knights? Well, that blend was novel and it birthed a cultural phenomenon. But if you break it down, audiences had already seen space adventure serials, and they'd also seen heroic medieval epics. They just hadn't seen them fused together. A couple of decades later, The Matrix pulled a similar trick. It took the cyberpunk digital reality concepts and spliced them with kung fu action and philosophical allegory. People said, "Wow, I've never seen anything like this before," yet each ingredient of The Matrix was familiar. Virtual reality, martial arts action, and the chosen one narrative. The film's brilliance was recombining them in a stylish, mind-bending way for the late 90s audience. As one commentary of these films noted, or the plots themselves which astound audiences, but the combination of those elements. The key is not finding something entirely new, but combining familiar things in a novel way. I honestly can't think of a clearer one-liner summary of any recombination model other than that. Now, what about the greatest of the greats? Let's talk about Shakespeare, often held up as a paragon of inventive literature. It turns out Shakespeare was more of a remixer than an inventor. Historical analysis of his plays shows that with only two exceptions, every plot Shakespeare ever wrote was borrowed from earlier sources. He took old stories from history books, folk tales, classical legends, and even recent Italian novellas and wove them into his plays. For example, Romeo and Juliet was based on a poem by Arthur Brooke, which itself was drawn from older Italian tales. Hamlet had roots in a Scandinavian legend. Macbeth was lifted from historical chronicles of Scottish kings. The Winter's Tale reworked a story by Robert Greene, a contemporary writer. Shakespeare's genius was not that he spun completely original yarns, but that he combined and elevated his source material, adding characters, twisting events, injecting poetry and depth to create something greater than the sum of the parts. If the Bard of Avon unapologetically borrowed and recombined, can any artist claim to be absolutely original? That's a food for thought. Moving on, science and technology tell a very similar tale. Every invention is a combination of prior technologies or ideas. The printing press, which is often heralded as one of the most revolutionary inventions, famously combined the concept of a movable type with the mechanism of a screw press and paper. The smartphone in your pocket is a combo of telephone, camera, computer, GPS, and more. All pre-invented components merge into a new whole. I started to see evidence of recombination everywhere I looked. One particularly illuminating study I found, which analyzed 17.9 million scientific papers for how they reference past knowledge. The authors wanted to see if the highest impact research was doing something special in how it drew on prior work. Their finding was astonishing. The most impactful papers tended to ground themselves in largely conventional combinations of existing knowledge, but with small infusions of atypical combinations. In other words, a great scientific work still builds on well-established foundations, yet it also brings together some strands of knowledge that don't usually meet. These papers that managed to introduce unusual pairing of ideas were twice as likely to become highly cited, top impact work. They quantified even the team aspect. Teams were 37% more likely than solo authors to inject novel combinations, presumably because multiple minds bring more diverse knowledge pools. This is recombination at the level of academia. Take a bit of theory from the field A, mix with a method from field B, and suddenly you open a door that neither field could see alone. It's gratifying that even in ivory towers, innovation is equals to remixing. It also reinforces the earlier point about the information threshold, where you need the conventional base and then one weird twist of combination to push beyond that frontier. Culturally, we also see periods of flourishing creativity often coincide with cross-pollination of ideas. The Renaissance, for example, was kicked off by the influx of classical knowledge from ancient Greece texts into medieval Europe. New inputs flooding in to be recombined with local knowledge, sparking innovations in art, architecture, science, and a lot more. The more I examined, the more I saw patterns here. When information and ideas flow and mingle, creativity booms. When cultures or minds stay isolated, creativity stagnates. So you might say that creativity itself has a kind of saturation point. If a person or a society keeps recombining the same old pieces of information again and again, eventually you exhaust the possibilities, and a state of recombination saturation is achieved. I suspect this is why we sometimes feel like an artistic genre or a scientific field has run out of ideas. Not literally out of ideas, but out of fresh inputs to make truly surprising combinations. The solution is usually to bring in something new from outside, breaking the saturation point. For instance, Western music in the early 20th century saw a burst of originality when composers started incorporating scales and rhythms from non-Western music. New inputs to shake up the old combinations. In our personal lives as creators, it suggests that to keep being creative, we should keep feeding our brain with new material and experiences. Stagnation is the enemy of originality, diversity of input is its ally. Well, by now, across neuroscience, AI, and historical examples, we've gathered a multifaceted answer to our initial question. It appears that yes, human creativity largely thrives on recombination of existing pieces. Whether it's neurons forging new link between memories, a machine remixing text patterns, or artists and inventors drawing on a prior art, the process has a common flavor. This doesn't make creativity any less wondrous. If anything, I find it beautiful that the new emerges from clever reconfigurations of the old. It's like watching a kaleidoscope. The pieces are given, but each twist reveals a pattern you've never seen before. Our creativity is the endless twist of the kaleidoscope of human culture and knowledge. I know we've learned a lot, but what do we do with this understanding? If creativity is essentially recombination of inputs, what does that imply for us as thinkers, for the future of AI, and for those philosophical puzzles like consciousness and free will? Let's take a moment to reflect on few implications and insights that emerged from this exploration. Firstly, I'm going to talk about reframing human ingenuity. This model demystifies creativity in a very helpful way. It shifts the narrative from genius produces something from nothing to genius knows what to collect and how to connect. This is empowering. It sort of means that creativity might be cultivated. If you want to be more creative, one strategy is clear: broaden and enrich your inputs. Read widely, experience different art forms, learn skills outside your comfort zone. You're effectively giving your brain more Lego blocks to play with. The information density threshold idea suggests that at some point, quantity transforms into quality. By amassing knowledge and memories, you increase the chance that two seemingly unrelated bits will collide in your mind and stick together in a brilliant way. It also means that everyday people can have creative insights, not just born geniuses. In fact, many breakthroughs come from outsiders or newcomers to a field who bring a perspective from elsewhere. The model levels the playing field. Your mind is a recombination machine, so feed it good ingredients. Don't be afraid to mix them oddly. The creativity paradox we discuss, which is constraints breeding creativity, also gives a practical tip. If you're stuck, try adding a constraint or a mixing in random elements. Limiting yourself to an unusual pair of influences can force a creative breakthrough. For example, challenge yourself to write a song using a strict format, or maybe design a product for an absurd scenario. The constraint might lead you to ideas you'd never consider in a blank space. Next, we move on to the inverse hierarchy where subconscious leads and conscious follows. This is more of a thought experiment on how our mental processes might sometimes work in reverse for creative tasks. Typically, we would imagine our conscious, top-down thinking as in charge, where we first set a goal and then the details follow. But in creative recombination, it often feels like the idea emerges unbidden, which is like a bottom-up scenario, and then our conscious mind reacts with an aha moment and applies polish to it. This hints that our brain's lower-level associative machinery, which is the kind where freely mixes memories or generates dreams, might be doing the heavy lifting, and only after it spits out a candid idea do the high-level cognitive parts step in to refine and implement it. It's almost like creativity requires the executive brain to take a backseat for a while, not to micromanage, so that the associative networks can do their chaotic exploration. Only once something interesting bubbles up does the executive mind re-engage to shape it and bring to fruition. Many creators talk about ideas coming to them during a walk or in a shower or maybe right after waking up, and the times when their conscious guard is absolutely down. This interplay between spontaneous generation and deliberate evaluation could be thought of as an inverse hierarchy because the impulse of the idea comes from lower levels rather than top level plans. It sort of challenges the notion of free will in a very subtle way. When I decide to write a novel, am I really originating that decision, or did a stew of prior inputs simmering in my subconscious push the idea up to me? I still choose to act on it or not, but the seed of idea might not be the top-down command. It might be an emergent product of lots of bottom-up activity. Next, let's talk about free will and originality. This brings us to the philosophical angle. What does it mean for free will and for a sense of originality if indeed everything new is composed of pieces of old? Well, some might argue that it makes us predictable machines. If theoretically, one had a complete map of every experience and memory in my brain, could they predict my next creative idea? Possibly in the same way that given all the training data of an AI and its algorithm, one can predict what it might generate. That thought can be unsettling. I think it edges towards the idea that free will or the creative soul is quite an illusion, and we are just extremely complex data processors. However, I'd be cautious against a nihilistic interpretation here. Being a recombinator doesn't negate creativity, it sort of contextualizes it. Think of it this way. A jazz musician improvises by drawing on scales and motifs they've practiced before, but the improvisation, the real time choice of what to play next, still feels like a willful live act. It is you doing the combining, using your agency to navigate the vast space of possibilities your life has given you. There's a wonderful metaphor in the concept of the adjacent possible, which is coined by the scientist Stuart Kaufman. It says at any given moment, based on the current state of knowledge, there's a horizon of what new ideas are feasible, like a shadow future of things that can be next. We can't invent beyond our time's adjacent possibilities, which is like a medieval tinkerer couldn't imagine a smartphone lacking requisite knowledge. But within the space, these choices exist. Free will might operate within the adjacent possible. You decide which connections to pursue out of the multitude your brain could make. Two creative people with the same knowledge base might come up with different combinations because they have different values, different random sparks of attention, different personal narratives guiding which connections resonate with them. That is where something akin to individual will or spirit might reside, in the preferences and selection among the many recombinations of your mind generates. Next, I'd like to talk about AI. Is it a partner or a rival in creativity? Understanding creativity as recombination also helps frame the role of the AI. If our creativity and AI's creativity shares this common mechanism, then the gap between human and machine creative output might narrow further as AI gets more data and better algorithms. We've already seen AI's assist in creative fields, which is suggesting new musical riffs, designing prototype products, aiding scientists by proposing hypotheses drawn from mixing datasets. Rather than viewing AI as a threat to human creativity, we might see it as a collaborator that excels at the brute force recombination, leaving humans to do the evaluative, meaningful selection. In fact, one intriguing implication of the recombination model is that quantity can lead to quality, if paired with good selection. AIs can generate hundreds of ideas, and a human can sift and recognize the ones that have promise. This hybrid approach leverages the machine breadth and human depth. It does raise the question though, if someday AI gets good at selecting too, say it can predict which ideas can be considered more creative or impactful, would we be edged out even in that role? Well, we'd then have machines that both generate and evaluate novel combinations at scale, which is a scenario that challenges our notions of human uniqueness. But for now, humans still hold the upper hand in judging meaning, value, and contextual fitness of creative ideas. Next, let's pick up consciousness. Is it really required for creativity? Well, the success of AI in mimicking creative outputs also provokes a deep question about consciousness. We often feel that our creativity is tied to our conscious experience, that the feeling of insight or the intention behind the art. Yet, here we have machines that have no subjective awareness, producing paintings and poems that move us. It suggests that a lot of what we call creativity can be achieved through unconscious or non-conscious processes. Remember the neuroscience evidence that much idea generation happens below awareness until the results pop out? Well, it could be that consciousness mainly steps in to string a narrative about the idea, giving us a sense of authorship. If an unconscious mechanism can do recombination, then perhaps consciousness is not strictly necessary for the mechanical process of creativity, though it may be necessary to have an intentional creativity, which is creating for something or with a purpose. Some philosophers argue that human creativity is special because we imbue our creations with meaning and understanding, and AI just manipulates symbols in the end, right? Well, this might be true. A painting by Van Gogh carries weight of his human experience, whereas an AI-generated painting carries whatever meaning we project onto it. Consciousness might thus not affect how ideas are generated, but it deeply affects why they are generated and how they are interpreted. In short, the recombination models decouples the generation of novelty from conscious mystique. The mystery of creativity might reside more in how we experience and value the creative act rather than the basic mechanics of producing the novelty. Finally, embracing input recombination forces us to refine what we mean by original. It's less about creating from the void and more about creating unexpected connections. Perhaps true originality is when someone combines elements so disparate or in such a clever way that it was highly unlikely, even given those pieces, that others would have put them together. So that improbability is what we really celebrate. For example, the inventor of the bicycle took the concept of a wheel and thought to put two in a line, adding pedals and steering bar. The wheels existed, the carts existed, but two wheels plus human balance was a non-obvious recombination at that time. Once done, it seems obvious in hindsight, like all great ideas. So maybe we judge creativity by the surprise factor of the combination itself. As our collective knowledge grows, some low-hanging combinations become obvious or even automated. So human creators may need to venture further out to more remote associative leaps to feel truly original. That could lead to ever more interdisciplinary and cross-domain creativity, which is quite exciting. It also means education and innovation policy should encourage cross-pollination, where silos are creativity killers, while forums for exchange are creativity boosters. Wow! Having walked through all these perspectives, I find the input recombination model not as a reductionist buzzkill, but as a unifying theory that connects dots all across the fields. It tells a story of creativity as a grand recycling project, an eternal remix playing out in our brains, in society, and now even in silicon chips. It also feels humbling and quite inspiring. Humbling because we see how much we owe to those who came before us. Every idea we have built is inherited from someplace, and inspiring because it means possibility is all around us. With every new experience or bit of knowledge we take in, we're essentially adding a new puzzle piece that could fit with others to unlock something absolutely fantastic. Perhaps the real artistry in creativity is recognition, as Stephen King said. Recognizing the idea when two pieces click together in your mind. So the next time you have a clever idea, you might want to pause and ponder what were the parent pieces. You might trace it back and smile, realizing how your brain repurposed a childhood memory with a recent article you read. And rather than feeling fraudulent that it's not original, you can feel the part of a grand creative web of humanity, doing your bit in recombining the ever-growing building blocks of knowledge in a way that only you would ever think to do. That was quite a lot. The journey we took in this episode is itself an explanation of recombination. We combined neuroscience computing and the history to form a coherent picture. In doing so, new questions have appeared on the horizon, almost like the next adjacent possible to explore. If creativity is recombination, can we predict creative trends by analyzing what pieces are available in the society? How can education systems optimize for better idea and combination skills? Will future AIs ever crack transformational creativity? And if so, what would that look like for humanity? These questions linger, inviting us to keep exploring. For now, we leave our story here with a new profound appreciation that even the wildest flights of imagination have footprints in yesterday's ideas. It's an ongoing evolution, not of the species but of the ideas, and each one of us, armed with our unique set of inputs, has the potential to recombine them into something wonderful. And that's where we leave it for today. If you enjoyed this exploration of how ideas really come together, take a second right now to follow HDcast in your favorite podcast app, tap the rating or the like button, and share this episode with one curious friend who loves a good mental adventure. Your word of mouth is the single best way to keep these conversations rolling. I also want your voice in the mix, so send us your questions. I read every note, every comment, and the most thought-provoking ones often spark future episodes. Until then, keep collecting those inputs, keep twisting the kaleidoscope, and I'll meet you back here soon for another deep dive. Thank you and goodbye.